Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in the Cell Saga of Dragon Ball Z, we learned that there were a number of different timelines in the story, all of which fractured off initially from the original timeline, where everything first took place in the universe. However, what exactly happened in the original timeline? What was its fate come the end of the Cell Saga, and additionally, what ended up happening even after that? Well, let's get into that topic right now. So in the original timeline of Dragon Ball, everything played out exactly the same way up until a certain point, which I'll get into soon. Initially, of course, we had everything taking place where Goku met Bulma, and she explained to him the Dragon Balls. Of course, before this, we had the events that led to Goku being on planet Earth in the first place, where Frieza destroyed planet Vegeta. And additionally, everything transpired the same way up throughout the course of the story. Goku met all of his different friends, they teamed up together on their different adventures, going around the world, gathering the Dragon Balls and making their wishes. Eventually, Goku would also go on to fight Piccolo Jr., marry Chi-Chi, fly off into the distance, and eventually have Gohan. And then everything else in Dragon Ball Z after this point took place the same as it did initially up until a point again. Goku fought against Frieza on Namek, he was the one who defeated him, and then eventually Frieza showed up on the Earth with his father King Cold, ready to enact revenge upon Goku by wiping out all of the Earthlings, as you could see right here, and by the time Goku comes, they think that they'll be able to defeat him, to wipe him out. So everything played out exactly the same way that we see it on screen in Dragon Ball Z up until this point right here, where Trunks, future Trunks in fact, enters the story. Now, the reason for this is because the fact that in the original timeline, there was no time travel. As a result, there was no event in which somebody went back from another timeline or came back in time to defeat King Cold and Frieza, as Trunks would go on to do. Rather, in the original timeline and the History of Trunks timeline, what happened was Goku showed up on the planet using his instant transmission and defeated both King Cold and Frieza himself. Trunks did not show up to wipe them out. Goku is the one who did this instead. And this is something that he actually explains to Trunks in the story, that he was right about to make his move and use the instant transmission in order to wipe out King Cold and Frieza until Trunks intervened and unnecessarily changed time because of his lack of knowledge regarding this. However, after this point, everything played out in the original timeline in a very similar way to, if not exactly the same way, as it did in future Trunks' timeline. Goku would go on to die of the heart virus, and the androids would show up and wipe out all of the Z fighters, except, of course, for Gohan. This would leave Trunks, the original Trunks, and the original Gohan, as we see here in the story, training, fighting. Trunks in the manga, of course, had already become a Super Saiyan before the events of Gohan's death. But the two of them were fighting together, trying to be able to eventually take out the androids. And what happened at this point? Gohan, he got frustrated. He got really angry seeing the atrocities committed in front of him by the androids. And so he knocked out Trunks with the idea that he would be able to go and sacrifice his life and maybe take out at least one of the androids. As you can see right here, he even mentions, if you die too, there won't be anyone left to protect the Earth. You're our one last hope. Let me actually learn how to read. You're the last one with a chance to beat those androids someday. And so Gohan rushed in. He wanted to try and take out at least one of them at this point. But unfortunately, as we find out, his training, as he discusses right here, that he's been training for that year in order to defeat 17, doesn't exactly pay off because, as we find out in the original version that Toriyama wrote in the manga, our turn, sorry to disappoint you, but I didn't even use half my power last time. He wouldn't let Gohan escape. Gohan, as you can see right here, he knows he's about to die. Android 18, she's reveling in that too because she's probably the more evil of the two. And as a result, Trunks finds Gohan and, he finds his dead body. And then 3 more years passed. Trunks at this point was about 14 years old. And as you could tell, was noticeably older looking and taller and looked way different than his mainline timeline counterpart at this point in Dragon Ball Super. But I digress. 3 years later passed, and we see the androids had inflicted even more damage. This is what's left of Capsule Corporation, and, they're doing their absolute best at this point just to survive, to scrape along. And Bulma figured she was going to create this time machine in order for them to be able to go back in time and stop everything from occurring, at least, in one timeline. And so at this point, Trunks seemed to think that he actually was strong enough to wipe out the androids. If I remember correctly, this line from Bulma saying, "Do you really think you're stronger than Gohan was actually not the correct translation. It's more that she is saying he is, but he's still not strong enough to win. And at this point, definitely that makes sense based upon what we see with Trunks. But Trunks races off in order to fight against the androids. He gets utterly defeated, which Toriyama was so disrespectful of Trunks here. He's like, I'm not even going to show that disrespect on screen, because he's going to get beaten so badly. The narrator doesn't even want to show that. And then at this point, Trunks wakes up. He's going to go back 17 years and give Gohan's dad his medicine. Everything's starting there. And that, basically what's going to happen is they're going to do their best to save Goku, because even if, for whatever reason they can't find a way to normally defeat the androids in the past, using the shutdown device or something, what would occur is that they would instead maybe just bring Goku back to the future and defeat them together. So at this point, the original Trunks went back in time. And when he did that, what happened? Well, he saved a timeline that we never see, the unseen timeline as it's called. And then at that point, Trunks comes back to the future and is able to defeat his own androids somehow. However, at this point, things take a more tragic turn for the original timeline, because as we find out, there was another time traveler that went to the main timeline and actually created the main timeline, and his name was Cell. And so Cell actually was able to use Trunks' original time machine, the original Trunks, and take that to go back in time. As we could see right here, it's explained momentarily exactly where he went to, which it says right here that he actually left from 3 years further in the future from when Trunks initially left and went back in time, and went back 4 years ago. Because Cell in this case used the time machine to go back to 1 year before Trunks showed up, that actually created the new timeline known as the main timeline, because in Dragon Ball's timeline, or Dragon Ball's time travel, what happens is if you go back before an initial travel, you create a new time machine because you are creating a new set of events, because that time machine, that new traveler existing just in that point in time, is something that didn't happen before, and thus branches off a new storyline. So I'll do a whole video explaining time travel in the future, but nonetheless, what happens is they find out exactly what occurred. Cell went back in time, and then we learn even more about this when he's fighting against Piccolo. Because Cell goes on to say that he actually sent himself back in the time machine, and what exactly happened here? Why did he do all of this to begin with? And so he explains his origin, that basically during the entire time everything was happening with the androids, Dr. Gero had already begun working on his ultimate creation, Cell, a artificial life form, a complete bioorganic android essentially. And it was going to take so long that his supercomputer, which was in a bunker underneath of the original bunker in which Android 1718 woke up from, was actually creating Cell. So the entire time while Trunks and Gohan, everyone in the original timeline, and then the history of Trunks, were fighting against the androids, there was another even more powerful one growing who was meant to absorb those ones and become perfect. And eventually, after Trunks had defeated the androids initially, as I'll get into right now with Cell's own words, he says that not only was he made from the cells of all of the different fighters who were, on the Earth at the time, with that being, Goku, Piccolo, Vegeta, Frieza, his father, and then some other life forms. Maybe Gohan was a part of that. Kind of hard to tell. But what does he actually say? at this point in terms of everything, that he found out that in order to become perfect, he needed the androids. And as a result, he went searching for them. But when he was activated in the future, 17 and 18 were gone. I don't know how, he says, defeated by Trunks perhaps. So Trunks somehow found a way in the past to defeat the androids, whether or not he used the remote shutdown device and then blew them up, or as I speculate on another video, another possible idea is that Trunks actually trained in the hyperbolic time chamber in the unseen timeline, came to the future and wiped out the androids there. And maybe he was just completely taken off guard by Cell, because why would he ever think that this thing would ever be a real threat to him? And if he shows up out of nowhere and kind of like strangles Trunks as we see in the anime version of this flashback, then it's entirely possible that he just broke his neck really quickly or something before Trunks could even channel his chi. But nonetheless, that's a whole other can of worms. Either way, what ended up happening is that Trunks was killed by Cell. The original Trunks, the last real powered fighter in the unseen timeline, was killed by Trunks, or was killed by Cell, who then went back in time in order to, in turn, basically create everything that we're seeing right here. However, there is the whole situation of where Trunks had actually programmed the time machine to go back to 1 year before the events of him going back initially, which would have actually created this timeline to begin with. So the question at that point is, why did Trunks really do that? I've discussed that in another video. It's possible that for all we know, when Cell killed Trunks, his head smacked on the control panel and actually sent him back a year before, instead of 4 years after he'd originally shown up, he actually went back 4 years before, or Trunks is just really bad at programming the time machine. Who really knows? But nonetheless, Piccolo speculated he was going to tell them about how he was able to destroy the time machine or the androids in the future. And that's what prompted Cell to go back in time in the first place. Somehow, I guess that during all this occurring, Cell was actually perhaps scouting out Trunks. So in the original timeline, or the History of Trunks timeline, we know what happens. Trunks defeats the androids by force, blows them away. And then at this point, as we saw in the end of the History of Trunks timeline, that timeline that was created in this instance, and the main story, Trunks had wiped out Cell after he was sneaking up on him and ready to repeat this process and basically turn it into an infinite loop, because if Cell killed Trunks again and went back in time, the same situation would just keep happening over and over and over again ad infinitum. So the fact that we see Trunks here actually knows what's going to happen this time, he knows Cell's plan, shows that that was something that happened differently. So in the original timeline, of course, Cell showed up here, he killed him, he went back in time, and then in turn he stopped, he caused everything to happen in the main story. But when it comes to the original timeline, nothing after this point is ever actually shown or mentioned again. None of this that we're seeing here took place in that initial timeline where Trunks is able to get advantage of Cell, blow him away, and stop everything from happening. Instead, Bulma was basically left without a son. There were no Dragon Balls left on the Earth, and seemingly everything was just kind of said and done. There was nothing really, left in that timeline aside from, the remnants of humanity just trying to build. It was a completely different downbeat ending compared to this one, which is that Trunks and Bulma had a hard life, but true peace had come at last, and then they were going to be there to defend it. Which, of course, in Dragon Ball Super, they also decided to give it a really downbeat, depressing ending for some reason, despite the fact that this was like a perfect ending for Trunks and, was a really great moment in the entire franchise. But nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that this was not what happened. It was the complete opposite. So what exactly did go on to happen in the main timeline, or the original timeline afterward? There's so many timelines, guys. You're not the only ones who have those confused sometimes. Just not me, of course, because I know everything. So again, that leaves the question open of what exactly happened after Trunks was killed by Cell and he went back in time. Was Bulma able to perhaps contact the new Namekians somehow, and then in turn be able to wish back those who were killed by the androids and Cell, thus bring back Trunks and everyone other than Goku, I suppose, because he died of the heart virus. And, those guys at that point would have been so powerful that, they they would have effortlessly defeated the androids after all these years of training in the afterlife. So, it is a question again as to why they didn't do a one-day visit, but I'm sure I've talked about that in videos in the past. And nonetheless, also, there is the question, too, of, did Majin Buu come to life again in the mortal universe? Did Babidi and Deborah show up on the Earth and resurrect him using the growing populace of the Earth? They didn't really have a bunch of superpowered individuals, but there's a chance they still could have wished him back. Additionally, maybe there was a version of Zamasu who went to the original timeline, and really that would have been the perfect timeline for him to go to anyway, instead of the history of Trunks, the future Trunks timeline that we know. Why wouldn't he just go there where there's literally no one there to oppose him? It would be so much easier to finish his goals, and then there would be no problem except for, I guess, Zeno and the gods of the other universes and the other universes, and the list goes on. So, all the people who should have been paying attention when he was wiping them out in the future Trunks arc. But again, they never really go into that. We were never told what happened. So ultimately, I feel like it was just kind of a tragic ending. Even though it would have been nice to see the original characters come back, the fact of the matter is that the original versions of Goku, of Gohan, of Trunks, of every character that we came to know and love throughout the course of the story all died a really dark, depressing, tragic ending. All of them were wiped out by the machinations of mankind, ironically. The very race that they worked in order to defend on the Earth came about and wiped them all out. The sins, the ghosts of Goku's past with Dr. Gero. He came back from, being the mastermind behind the Red Ribbon Army to ultimately getting himself killed and then also killing everyone other than Goku, ironically. So, it was really a heart virus, a kind of biological incident that ultimately led to Goku, the main character of the story, ceasing to be within it at that point, and his entire timeline devolving and falling apart until eventually there was nothing really left of it that we knew and loved to begin with. And so that is the history and the tragedy of the original timeline of Dragon Ball. But let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. What do you think happened? Additionally, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
And you better subscribe!